Good evening, everyone. It's about 8 o'clock here in the East Coast and 5 o'clock on the West Coast, where our guest tonight is joining us. I'm Chip Gibbons, and I'm the Policy Director of Defending Rights Dissent, and I also host the Still Spying podcast. Still Spying is a limited podcast series produced by Defending Rights Dissent and is based on this report we published with the same name. It focuses on FBI surveillance, particularly political surveillance, both past and present. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to stillspying.org, as well as visit, of course, rightsanddissent.org and learn about all of the work we do at Defending Rights and Dissent to both rein in FBI political surveillance and defend the right to political expression more generally. Tonight, we have a very special event put together by Defending Rights and Dissent, the Still Spying podcast, and Repeater Books. We're going to be taking a deep dive with author Aaron J. Leonard into a particular era of FBI surveillance. However, while it's history, unfortunately, it's still very relevant to the present, as just a few hours ago, our Attorney General, William Barr, recommended to other federal prosecutors on a conference call charging Black Lives Matter protesters with sedition. So tonight, I'm joined by Aaron J. Leonard. Aaron is a writer and historian with a focus on the history of radicalism and state suppression. He is a contributor to the History News Network, Jacobin, and Truthout. He's the author of Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, A Threat of the First Magnitude, FBI Counterintelligence and Infiltration from the Communist Party to the Revolutionary Union, and the book you came to hear about, Folk Singers and the Bureau, the FBI, the folk artist, and the suppression of the Communist Party, 1939 to 1956. Those last two books are from Repeater Books and are available wherever fine books are sold. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me on. By the way, Repeater, I believe, is running a 50% off sale, so you can go to repeater.com. So
go to repeater.com.
Could I make one comment? Because you were talking about Bill Barr and sedition.
I will always accept a comment on Bill Barr, who I feel like is the Dick Cheney of the Donald Trump administration.
Yeah, no, I had seen that too before we started this podcast, and it reminded me of 1940 in Oklahoma. The Communist Party was subject to multiple raids on their bookstore and on their residences. They were given state charges of criminal syndicalism, which essentially was, conspiring to overthrow the government. This was something that Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, they had been down in Oklahoma just a couple months or maybe even several weeks before. And Seeger, in his memoirs, say that him and Woody barely missed getting caught up in that. The folks in Oklahoma were charged and convicted. They ended up having their sentence put aside because of the shifting policies of the Communist Party. The Communist Party went from being against the European war to
we're going to talk about that tonight. Yeah. And that's mentioned in your book, right? That was the incident where they arrested the patrons as well, and someone who used the typewriter.
Exactly. Yep.
I was looking at that, and imagine going to visit a bookstore and then finding yourself on trial for sedition.
Yeah, criminal syndicalism.
Yeah. So, Aaron, this is your third book on the FBI. Your first two books focused on Maoist groups in the 60s and 70s and other groups who broadly fall into either the New Left or New Communist movement periods. What made you turn to folk singers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s?
That's a good question, because it was not my intention. I set out to write a book. I wanted to change it up a little. I was going to write a book about musicians in the 60s and 70s. I thought, given the attention to groups like the Black Panthers, the Weathermen, the Revolutionary Union, that the FBI probably had a whole body of files on people like Jefferson Airplane and MC5. I was disappointed. I started looking, and the request came back saying the FBI either didn't have the files or they'd been destroyed. I suspect the material was there to do it, but it was not quite the same. But in the course of doing this, I read this book, Bob Dylan's America by Sean Willens. And he talked about Woody Guthrie and Woody Guthrie's association with radicalism. So that moved me to ask for Woody Guthrie's file, which came right away. It was a file that had been released in 1980. And then I quickly discovered that Woody's file for New York and Los Angeles were in the National Archives, and nobody had ever looked at them except for the FBI. And then that led me to ask for Pete Seeger's file, for Burl Ives, Sam the Snowman, for his file. And there was a multitude of files because all these folks had various relationships to the Communist Party. So there was a body of formerly secret stuff to look at, and there was a plethora of memoirs and various scholarship on. So I went with that, and I was always kind of fascinated with what happened to the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s, and it's a pretty intense story with a lot of relevance.
Yeah, your book sort of both doubles as a story of the folk singers themselves, as well as sort of a primer on sort of the relationship between the Communist Party and U.S. society over this 20-year period. And I'm going to tease that out a little bit more later in the program. But first, I want to ask you, what were the relationship between these folk musicians, or folk musicians in general, and movements for radical social change?
Well, the people I profile are mainly associated with the Communist Party USA. I guess the shorthand that gets used today is they're Stalinist, which I don't think is actually accurate. Stalin was the head of the Soviet Communist Party, but there was a whole global international movement. So I think it kind of oversimplifies it. It is my view that in that period, if you were radical, if you wanted a fundamentally different world, you would be attracted to the Communist Party. Yes, there were other groups. There were Trotskyists, there were socialists, there was the left wing of the Democratic Party and FDR. But among the most radical and the most committed, they were attracted to the Communist Party, which is why Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Sis Cunningham, Alan Lomax, Burl Ives, Millard Lampell, all these people end up in this particular mix. And I outline, in the opening chapter, how they all came from Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Jersey, West Virginia, and ended up converging in New York in 1940. People like Josh White and Paul Robeson as well. The party was singular or outstanding, I guess, in its opposition to Jim Crow and the oppression of Black people in the United States. There were other groups like the NAACP, but the Communist Party was, for all their problems, and their problems were many, they were extremely staunch in their stand against the way Black people in the United States were treated. As a result, a lot of Black people joined their ranks, or a significant number joined their ranks, and made common cause with them.
That brings me to a question I wanted to ask you later in the evening, but I'll ask it now. A lot of people listening at home might be wondering, how could anyone have been attracted to the Communist Party? They think about Stalinism, like you're mentioning, and obviously it's a political organization that's been heavily maligned for decades. But a lot of these folk singers and a lot of idealistic people in the 30s and 40s did gravitate towards this organization. What was it that they saw in it, or what made them do that? Try to help people who might find that sort of politically unpalatable or even repulsive understand what was going on.
Yeah, no, it's important. First off, look, I've got a pretty developed critique of the Communist Party in the United States, so I'm not here to, erect a false narrative about it. Saying that, in the 30s and 40s, the party was, they had this slogan that they developed in the 30s, that communism is 20th century Americanism. It both concentrates the limitation of the party, but also its appeal. I think it was much more social democratic than it was communist. They felt like, labor unions, needed to be respected, and they needed to be widespread. There ought to be equality among different ethnicities and races. And, they stood with the Soviet Union, which was at once the source of their power, but it was also why they were so fraught. I mean, the Soviet Union, whatever their foreign policy was, the Communist Party followed suit. And, they were just one party and many in this communist international, this Comintern, which spread across the globe. Communism around the world was a very big deal. It seemed to have sorted out how to lay hold to the state apparatus, to socialize things, to create a certain equality. In the midst of the Depression, the Soviet Union was not suffering unemployment in the way that much of the West was. Of course, we know that the collectivization and such was extremely problematic, but there was appeal. There was a sense that some of the problems people were confronting in the West were being answered. The fact of the matter is there are still problems in the West that are not being answered. The difference is there's no alternatives to point to. But in the 30s and 40s, if you were looking for answers, it seemed like there was one there, and that was the attraction.
And also the party was very active on domestic issues, like you mentioned, like racial justice, trade unions, things like that.
I think people didn't join the party because they loved Stalin. They joined the party because they wanted a better United States.
Yeah.
Maybe they shouldn't, should they or shouldn't they have? Well, the irony is I suspect a lot of people who are in the streets now, a good chunk of them would have been attracted to the Communist Party back then. And maybe they would have regretted it 20 years later, but
that is what our president says. So, with a very different meaning. So, what are some of the folk singers you profile in your book that our audience tonight might be familiar with, like Woody Guthrie, and what was their deal?
Well, Woody Guthrie is probably the most famous, and people may or may not know him. I mean, everybody knows this song, "This Land Is Your Land." I actually have an article coming out in History News Network that should be published this weekend, which is, the title is "The Communism in This Land Is Your Land." So I dissect the song. I talk about Guthrie's relationship to the party, and I get into why you can hear that song so many different ways. A lot of people have real problems with the song, and other people really love the song. I'm not going to spoil the article. You can give it a look. But Guthrie wrote "This Land Is Your Land," "I Ain't Got No Home." You can look through the canon of music. He does this famous song of "Plane Wreck at Los Gatos," about people, being sent back to Mexico after having worked in the fields in California. Their plane crashes, and the headline says, "Oh, they're just deportees." And it still resonates because this is still happening a lot. Guthrie was just one of these artists who seemed to be able to absorb the world around him and send it back to us in a way that was concentrated and beautiful, so that singers today can pick up a Guthrie song, and if their heart's in the right place, they can do something magical. Guthrie is pursued. He's not disciplined. He can't really stay in the party probably for more than a few months, and they say, you're not disciplined enough to do this. He was supposed to show up on a street corner to sell the Daily Worker, and he didn't, so they disciplined him. But he maintained support of the party all his life, and the FBI maintained a file on him well up into the 60s when he was dying of Huntington's chorea, which is a neurological disease that erases your ability to speak, walk, and just have control of your whole organism. The FBI kept the file open on him until 62, 63, actively, while he was degenerating. Pete Seeger, people know, Pete Seeger is like an American icon. He's the one who popularized the song "We Shall Overcome." Seeger's a very interesting character. He excavated all these folk songs that, he brought forward into the 60s, which, my sense is it had a big basis for the rock revolution, that went on from there. But he was called in front of Congress and faced 10 years in prison for refusing to talk about communists or people he knew who were communists. And Burl Ives, who I mentioned earlier, every Christmas, we see Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the guy who sings Holly Jolly Christmas, was called in front of the Congress for his attending meetings of the Communist Political Association. Sadly, Burl Ives named names, in order to try to get out from underneath that kind of impression. And then, there are more. I'm not going to, go through a whole encyclopedic recounting, but these are people you might know and you might not know, but they actually are still influential. They're not just, hidden, irrelevant figures. They actually had a long-standing impact.
The phrase that gets commonly thrown out with Guthrie's relationship to the party is fellow traveler. Could you explain what that means?
Well, yeah, fellow traveler is somebody who's very supportive of the party or has common goals, walks the same road. The thing I do in this book, which I don't know if it's controversial or not, but the anti-communism in this country is such that, if you read any books about anybody who had an association with the Communist Party, you walk away thinking, oh, yeah, well, at best they were a fellow traveler. Well, but, really, the government was just chasing phantoms, looking for reds under the bed. In 1949, coming out of World War II, the Communist Party had almost 100,000 people. It was popular. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies in World War II. And this is something people I don't think understand. The Soviet Union did the lion's share of fighting against, the fascists in Germany and arguably, defeated Nazi Germany much more so than the United States. The Soviet Union lost 20 million people. The U.S. lost 400,000. The party supported, the U.S. government and were allies of the Soviet Union, which is why they were able to get so big. I think I lost your question, though, Chip.
Was what is a fellow traveler? But you answered several other of my questions.
Yeah, well, some of these people were fellow travelers, but mainly what I found out is most of them were not. They had been in the party for a while, and if they left, they continued to support it. Around 49, 50 people did start leaving the party. And I document in the book the turmoil that was going on both in the party and the repression the government was bringing down. But for a time, these folks more than just walked the same road. They went to meetings.
It's interesting, some of the things you've pointed out about how anti-communism has been sort of portrayed in popular culture. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but when the film Trumbo came out, it was sort of an interesting turning point, because it wasn't the first film to depict sort of quote-unquote McCarthyism, though the Hollywood 10 hearings predate Joseph McCarthy himself, or even sort of the process to name names in Hollywood. But it was the first one where the protagonist was actually someone who was in the party, as opposed to this sort of like well-meaning liberal who gets swept up in a witch hunt. And later in the Still Spying podcast series, we're having on as a guest Ellen Schrecker, who is the preeminent historian of McCarthyism in the United States and wrote the first post-Cold War history of McCarthyism, Many Other Crimes, which is still, I think, widely considered one of the best books. And she's coming on to talk about how the FBI was the bureaucratic heart of the McCarthy period. But she makes some of the same points you make about how it's important to sort of move away from this narrative about these sorts of well-meaning people who were accidentally swept in, and be like, no, to a certain extent, this was about targeting a particular political project. And of course, as an organization that defends the free speech rights of everyone, regardless of their views, I mean, that's quite terrible still.
Yeah, and it's not something that the overall structure, the status quo wants to make a big point of. But look, in 1949 and 1950, after Mao Zedong, led the Chinese People's Army in seizing power, 1/3 of everybody alive lived under some kind of socialist government. The United States was freaking out. I mean, Mao's seizing power in China you can draw a fairly straight line between that and the way the United States dug in Vietnam. But the United States was attempting to defend Western capitalism. It was not a settled question who was going to win out. And the anti-communism was fierce. And it started before McCarthy. It started in 1947. There's a section in the book where I quote a letter Martin Dees, who headed a congressional anti-communist committee, wrote to Harry Truman, in which he outlined, I believe it's like 7 things that needed to be done to eliminate communism in the United States. Not letting communists head the unions, instituting loyalty oaths, making the Communist Party, essentially illegal. I mean, all these points were implemented in a matter of a couple years, and it wasn't some big congressional debate. And then the media you want to see a crazy movie, go watch, I think it's called Big Jim McCabe with John Wayne, who plays the House Un-American Activities Committee investigator. It's totally Cold War propaganda, but it's the culture. If you were a communist, you were probably considered worse than a pedophile in that period. So, and without fascism ever being declared, it was totally within the ruling instruments, and that's actually the shocking thing. There was no fascism day. It was just one thing after another, all through Congress and the elected officials and media reports.
Yeah, and my organization traces itself back to the to an organization dedicated to abolishing the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it's worth pointing that HUAC was actually established in the 1930s and goes on into the 1970s. It changes name to House Internal Security Committee, but it is very much a process that is much sort of larger than sort of one demagogic senator from Wisconsin. So,
yeah, exactly. And they tried to hang it all on McCarthy, which, what I have a presentation and I show this slide where there's McCarthy by the microphone, and right by his right hand is Bobby Kennedy.
Yes.
Straight out of law school, Bobby Kennedy goes to work for Joe McCarthy.
That is
Bobby Kennedy's the guy who signs the wiretap order on Martin Luther King, and he gets a pass historically. Oh, Hoover manipulated him. Like, okay, Bobby Kennedy's that stupid, right?
He also, as Attorney General, was approving a lot of the foreign covert actions, which I've never quite understood how the Attorney General has purview over the CIA's covert actions. But he was very aggressive, both domestically.
He's a serious Cold Warrior. I don't know if toward the end of his life he ideologically changed. It's something I'd like to understand better, but in the early 60s, he was not cool.
It's a succinct summary. And I think the point about it not being just McCarthy is important. Our founder, Frank Wilkinson, pointed out that if he was to call it something other than the McCarthy era, he would rather call it the Hoover era, which is a point that Alan Schrecker also makes in her book, that if people knew in the 40s what historians know now, we would have called it Hooverism, not McCarthyism, and that the FBI was...
Well, I appreciate the spirit of what you're saying. I guess I would say, though, what I've discovered is, look, FDR supported Hoover. FDR is the guy who gave Hoover power. Truman, relied on Hoover's intelligence. I'm not quite sure how his relationship with Eisenhower went, but LBJ loved J. Edgar Hoover. So there's this quote I came across from some Democratic senator or congressman from New York, where Hoover's last budget testimony, and he said to Hoover, I think we all sleep better at night knowing you're at your post.
Everyone loved him. Not everyone, but like in Washington, he was widely loved. I think in the book, Many Are the Crimes, they mentioned that the FBI got the budget it requested every time except for like 4 times. And in those 4 times, they got a larger budget than what they asked for. So,
they try to reduce it to, Hoover just had the goods on everybody. And, probably there's some truth to that. But fundamentally, he was playing a role, and he was actually quite good at a lot of what he did.
No, I think your point is definitely fair. I don't think it's good to reduce the FBI's political surveillance to like Hoover had particular pathologies. The point I always bring up is that when Hoover first joins the Bureau of Investigation, he had its intelligence division, which is initially called the Radical Division. So basically a red squad in the federal police. And in the time period after the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago, late 19th century, early 20th century, many police departments across the country developed red squads. So the fact that the FBI's precursor, Bureau of Investigation, would have a radical division is just very much in line with this sort of elite consensus that police and intelligence needs to be used to blunt certain domestic political movements. And the fact that the guy who heads the radical division then goes on to head the bureau is its own history. So what were some of the consequences for these folk musicians for their associations with radical politics?
Well, it's a good question, because I think if you look at it in more microscopically, it seems like, well, no big deal. Everybody, nobody got killed. Nobody really went to prison. And one of the points I make first off, all these people have FBI files, and the consistency running throughout the files is if you're in the Communist Party or the FBI has evidence that you're in the party, if they presume or they highly suspect you're in the party, they add you to their security index, which is a detention list that FDR had actually asked for in 1939 when they were getting ready to go to war in Europe. If you're on the security index, the FBI every 6 months is making sure that they know where you live so they can put you in a detention facility. If you want to know what that looks like, just look at what they did to the Japanese during World War II. I mean, it was the same model. And this list stayed in effect for decades until the early 70s. So Guthrie's on the list, Seeger's on the list, Sis Cunningham's on the list, Bess Lomax, Millard Lampell. So they have this sort of Damocles that they don't even know is over them, which is that if the U.S. goes to war with the Soviet Union, they're going to be rounded up. And then the other thing is the blacklist. And the blacklist is, it's probably not the best term, because you kind of get the sense of it's actually a master list. You can either work or you can't work. It's a little bit more insidious than that. It's more like your name is out there publicly as somebody who is not going to be allowed in certain realm of the public square. And I kind of make the point that the United States is a wealthy country. It's the victor in World War II. They don't have to put people in prison on the scale that you would in a country that's more struggling to maintain a grip on power. I mean, the use of soft power to ensure the smooth functioning of things is more the route that things go. But it does have an effect. Like Pete Seeger is on a blacklist. He can't appear on television, but he can appear on college campuses. Mm. You can't write for Hollywood films. It's simply not going to happen, but you can, do writing projects, freelances under a pseudonym and things like that. But I kind of conclude the book saying, and then, people like Pete Seeger is confronting prison for not cooperating with Congress. Burl Ives, Josh White, both are called in front of Congress. Had they not cooperated, they would have been facing prison. So you are coerced into moral compromise. So you're going to be alienated from your whole artistic community depending on the stand you take. And it kind of actually comes down almost to, how could things have been? And, I don't want to dwell too much on that, but the limitations, the stresses, like Lee Hayes, who was one of the weavers, talked about, it ruined his health. For 2 years, he waited for the subpoenas to come because, this is a life-defining moment. You're in front of Congress, the cameras are all there. How you act, how you behave, either sends you to prison or sends you to be, alienated from all your friends. I mean, and these are for artists who are, a peculiar kind of person, and I don't say that in a disparaging way. So those are the implications. I mean, it's not a story of brutal murder or imprisonment or torture. It's a story of the way the workings of the status quo is, keeping things, in a certain realm.
Yeah, and just for some context for people who aren't familiar with the Security Index, in 1955, which is the height of the Security Index, there were 26,174 people on it. So that is quite a vast array of surveillance. So one of the things that has come up a lot, and I want to tease out more directly right now, is that the FBI was razor focused on the Communist Party for a very long time. And these folk singers who were targeted by the FBI were a casualty of that fixation. So as a result, your book is also sort of a history of the Communist Party and its relationship to American society writ large. You mentioned how sort of when the party got these folk singers involved, maybe during the war or slightly before the war, World War II, it was very different than what happened, at the height of the Cold War. So for people unfamiliar with this topic, could you give us sort of a brief overview of the Communist Party's relationship with society writ large from 1939 to 1956?
Yeah, well, throughout the 30s, they had able to, attract a certain following. Most notably, look, in the 30s, the United States was an industrial country. Manufacturing was a very big deal. The Communist Party, from decades of experience, had influence in the trade unions, and they were able to achieve leadership positions in a number of them, which was like hugely consequential. They had unemployed councils, where if somebody was evicted, and seems to be happening somewhat today, the unemployed councils would organize in the neighborhood, probably a lot in New York, which is the party's strong base. Somebody's furniture was being moved out to the sidewalk, the unemployed councils would move it back in. They were active against the persecution of the Scottsboro Boys. There was 9 young black men, I believe. I'm going to say Alabama, but check me on that.
It was Alabama.
Yeah, they were accused of rape, and they took up that cause. That it was a spurious charge, and has a lot of connections to the Central Park Five, which came decades later. So they were all involved in that. I guess the other end of that question, I thought this was what you're going to ask, and you can tell me if we go there some other time, is how the government actually moved on them, because that was actually,
government, that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, because this was astonishing to me. I don't know if people know what the Smith Act is. It's actually a law that's still on the book, but it was passed around 1940, aimed at immigrants who were subversives, and it aimed to send them out of the country or send them to jail. It was initially used against the Trotskyists in 1940 because they didn't support the U.S. going to war in Europe. Some of their people were convicted and sent to jail. The Communist Party
didn't support that conviction.
Yeah, the Communist Party just stood aside, to their shame.
Yes.
But then the Smith Act came back in 1948, and the government systematically went after the top leaders of the party. They put 9 people on trial, the very top leadership. They're all convicted. The Supreme Court upholds it. They go to jail for 5 or 10 years. And then after the initial convictions, the sentence, I need to check on the fact. I know it's at least 5 years in federal prison because they served from like 51 to 56, most of them. But after the initial convictions of the very top leaders, the government goes after the second echelon leaders. I think they ended up sending something like 60 odd people to prison, trying 120 in total. So it's a decapitation on a grand scale. People don't even, have any sense of what was going on. The Smith Act, was not that you were working to overthrow the government. It was that you taught the desirability or the advocacy of overthrowing the government. I mean, you can now advocate revolution in this country legally, but to do so in 1949 was a felony. And that's how they decapitated the party. And then they also did the Taft-Hartley Act, which said, if you're a communist or you advocate the overthrow of the government, you cannot be the head of a union. So this put their party union leadership in the position of either resigning the party or, staying in the party and leaving the union, or lying and going to prison for perjury. So in this way, they systematically went after the strongest points of the organization. And then in the media, I mentioned the John Wayne movie, they made communists to be sneaky pariahs. And there's a multitude of other things. I don't want to just kind of keep going on and on, but the book gets into it. I try to weave throughout, how these anti-communist measures are happening in tandem with, what's happening with our folk singers, who are basically just elements of a larger repressive suite that's going on.
Yeah, I guess the thing that always sort of disturbs me or scares me is just how quickly the situation changed for these people. I mean, you could think back, like, communists or radicals have always been reviled. There's a strong, anti-radicalism streak in this country. We have the Palmer raids, we have Eugene Debs being persecuted under the Espionage Act, the destruction of the Wobblies, McCarthyism, etc. But in all of these periods where there's heightened repression, the previous, phase isn't necessarily mass revulsion at these people and their politics. It's actually a period of increased acceptance, I feel like. So the Socialist Party before World War I had members elected to Congress. They had mayors. Many people will say the war hurt them, but if you actually go back and look at their vote total, they, were doing better on their anti-war platform after the U.S. went into war. Victor Berger is elected in Wisconsin on an anti-war platform. Congress refuses to seat him. They have a special election. They vote him back. Congress still refuses to seat him. They don't have another election in Wisconsin. And then in the 30s and 40s, especially during World War II, when the Communist Party when the Soviet Union is allied with World War II, there's an increased acceptance. And a lot of these people just don't, and why would they, just don't see that the axe is about to fall on them. And that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, one of the revelations for me is, look, I caught the tail end of the 60s. I mean, I was just very, very young, but, I consider myself of that era. And, we had a lot of contempt for the Communist Party. And the irony is so we're out there making fun of the Communist Party and we're saying, oh, there ought to be a revolution, without really realizing it was the Communist Party who successfully, went to court and argued against these Smith Act convictions that allowed us to be able to say that. That doesn't mean the Communist Party is just some great thing and we had it wrong all along. I think, the critique, holds water, at least in my sense, in a lot of respect. The Communist Party in the 60s was just very sycophantic toward the Soviet Union and stuff. But look, history is history. And these folks, these were some brave people to deal with what they dealt with. And I think people today need to not be quite so firm in their opinions of the people who came before them. They ought to try to really understand them, which is not to say be, servile to history, but they ought to understand what the actual thing that, and I say this by way of, I guess, a certain thing I've learned the hard way. I mean, my contempt was not reasonable in some respects. These people were heroic. They went to prison. Their leader went to prison twice. This guy, Earl Browder, who is maligned as a revisionist, and, in the tenets of Marxism, he does fit that description, but he did go to prison for his belief a couple times, which says something about, his integrity.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think people who aren't, which vast majority of the population aren't in sort of certain left circles, would be shocked to know that, especially in the 60s and 70s, and to a lesser extent today, because they are less thought of, that the Communist Party was viewed as sort of very much a conservative institution as opposed to a bed of radicalism. And given the way they've been presented in the media, I think a lot of people would find that just mind-boggling. So the anti-communist repression we've been talking about was carried out by the FBI. It was also carried out by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and as you so poignantly point out in your book, by private right-wing forces. Could you talk about the role each of these forces played in political repression, as well as the interplay between the three of them?
Oh, that's a challenging question, Chip.
You've got 30 seconds to do it. You've got 30 seconds. Explain the FBI, HUAC, and the American Legion in 30 seconds.
Well, Congress and the FBI are on the same team, including organizationally. The FBI is, they're always saying, "Oh, we just do research. We don't make conclusions." So they're investigating the heck on who they think's in the party and what they think they've done. And they're sending this to the senators and the congressmen. And the congressmen have the power of subpoena and the power to send people to prison. So, they're very tightly working together on that. The book talks about the initial Hollywood 10 when the writers from Hollywood are brought before the House Un-American Activity Committee. They refuse to answer questions, and they're all given contempt citations. That's how Dalton Trumbo ended up in prison. I didn't know this, and you probably do, but Bertolt Brecht was one of the people called in front. Bertolt Brecht fled Hitler, and then he comes here and he has to flee Truman and the FBI. I mean, for me, that's a rather damning indictment about the so-called freedom in the United States. There's more to be said on that, but I don't want to lose the thread of your question. The private stuff, there was this group called Counterattack, and there are still these people. These people are probably more a force now than they were, which is these private companies and individuals who take it on themselves to investigate subversion. We see that a lot in the right-wing media. This group, Counterattack, took it on themselves to print something called Red Channels, where they documented, every celebrity on radio or television, or the films who they said had associations with Communist Party. And if you ended up with your name in their book, you wouldn't be able to work. They talk about you'd go interview for a part, and the guy interviewing you, and it probably was a guy, would take a look at Red Channels to see if your name was in the book. And if your name was in the book, it was a non-starter. This is the project of 3 former FBI agents. So you see a connection. I don't think Hoover really liked these 3 FBI agents because I think he was very territorial, but they drew on that methodology and expertise. And then the media. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. There's a number of people interviewed in the book who are testifying to Congress who, because of, journalism can get you in places that the police can't, they would, publish these reveals, about how the Communist Party was operating in People Songs, which was an entity for artists to kind of take music to the working class. These journalists would publish these things, and they would literally warn the congressman, you need to be aware of this. This is serious business. So you have this whole mix. It's not a perfect conspiracy. It's not a Glenn Beck Venn diagram, where they're all meeting. It's some of it is organized, but it's social, and at a certain point when you set a certain framework, and the media does this all the time, it's like it works itself out as to the conclusion, the result you want. The result you want is anybody with any association of communism, not being allowed any kind of voice outside of a very small marginal grouping. So that's the best I can do on a short version.
No, I think that's excellent. I think that is an excellent and succinct answer. I will say that Bertolt Brecht is my favorite playwright, actually.
Well, good for you.
I had a really good experience. I saw 2 very interesting, I'll get back on task in a minute, 2 very interesting off-Broadway productions of one of Galileo, one of the Caucasian Chalk Circle. One had the actor from Amadeus in it, one had the scientist from Back to the Future. And the best review, and possibly the best article I ever read about Brecht of the Galileo one, was in the American Conservative. It was the most most poignant exploration of Brett I have ever seen, which is a story for a very different day. So I want to talk to you about Paul Robeson. He's not traditionally thought of as a folk singer, but you make a good case in your book for including him in it, including that he's in the cultural milieu of radical artists at this time. He faced quite a bit of repression. He was hauled before HUAC, he had his passport taken, but one particularly harrowing incident is the Peekskill riots. Could you explain how Robeson came to be the target of such vicious repression and what happened in Peekskill?
Yeah, so Paul Robeson, he's one of the most important actors in the world in the mid-1940s. He is an actor, he's an opera singer, he's a scholar, and he's an athlete, and he's African American. So this is like the exact not what white supremacist United States wants as a role model for its children. But Robeson, has achieved these things both because of his own talent and his association with the Communist Party. He is at a peace conference in Europe. I believe it's in 1947, and he gives a speech, which is, in my reading, it's kind of innocuous. It's basically, look, World War III is not going to be cool. Black people really don't have any interest in it. And I'm totally paraphrasing. What he said is controversial because it's released to the press before he actually gives the speech. And the speech is reported in the press that Paul Robeson is saying, black people won't fight for America. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of like that BoJack Horseman, when he says,
yes.
Hey, well, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but it's.
We've done Brett, you might also do BoJack Horseman as well.
Yeah, it's a Fox News moment where, he's reviled in the media. How dare, and they go out to all these black leaders, and they're all like, how dare he deign to speak for Black America? He doesn't speak for me. He doesn't speak for black people. And the whole fury is whipped up around it. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Communist Party have been indicted on the Smith Act. They're going to trial in Lower Manhattan. There is a benefit concert by this Center for Civil Rights.
Congress, I think.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. They sponsor a concert at the end of August up in Peekskill, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley, a couple hours north of New York. And the American Legion and some other right-wing organizations organized to protest Robeson singing there. The Peekskill newspaper says, look, we used to like Robeson, but he's a communist now. We don't want him here. Just this, we don't need this. And these right-wing forces basically lay siege to the concert site the night before. They trap women and children. There's dozens of them there setting up. They beat people. People are locked in there overnight, terrified. Some are sent to the hospital. The concert is canceled. Robeson had gone up on the train but had to turn back. They rescheduled the concert for a couple weeks later, and it comes off because the organization is more astute. There's actually thousands of former veterans and union officials who set up a security cordon. If you want to, just a side note, Billy Bragg does a song called My 30,000 on his Mermaid Avenue album, which recounts the story from Woody Guthrie's view. But as people are leaving the successful concert, the police basically allow the mob to lay a gauntlet down. And a gauntlet is, two sides of the street are people violently attacking the cars with rocks. Ronnie Gilbert of the Weavers says this one guy had a pile of rocks set up in a pyramid, and he's throwing rocks at the bus like a baseball. People hurt, they're sent to the hospital. This goes on for hours. The police facilitated. There's a cross is burned. Later, the state investigates and said, oh, it was a prank. Some teenagers, as a prank, burned a cross, as if there's any possibility of that kind of symbolism being viewed as a prank. I had not heard about the Peekskill riot in detail until I read a book in 2016. And at the time, the Trump rallies were going on. And I thought, well, there's this ugliness just festering right underneath the surface, waiting to be called up. In Peekskill, they were out there saying, commies go back to Russia, N-word go back to Russia. They were calling Jewish people kikes. I mean, it was just a mix of like the worst kind of white supremacist, racist, anti-Semitic.
Some really awful violence too. I believe I read another book where like someone loses an eye or an arm or something. Right.
Well, I can't validate that. That sounds true, but people were seriously injured. Yes, yeah. It's amazing nobody died. It's amazing nobody died, but I think you and I were talking a little informally beforehand. It's like the way the mob is used to make a political point, because this was in sync with this trial that was going on. And the status quo, the powers that be, or whatever you want to call it, essentially allowed Peekskill to happen and did not apologize for it afterwards. And that's the way it works.
And that's something that we're seeing again today. We're seeing these right-wing vigilante groups who are very hopped up because of this inflammatory and conspiracist rhetoric about Antifa. Antifa is anti-fascist. It's an ideology. It's not an organization. But you have, leaders and pundits and others coming on television saying, Antifa is coming to get you. Antifa is coming to get you. It sort of occupies almost the same place in the reactionary mind as the Communist Party did at this time, as this sort of sinister, shadowy force that's everywhere. They're behind anything. If Black people are protesting, getting shot by the police, it's not because they're angry at racism. It's because they've been whipped up by Antifa. Everyone was happy with segregation in the South before the communists came, like this sort of, ridiculous narrative of outside agitators. And we are seeing, armed vigilante groups in Oregon. These conspiracy theories have spread that Antifa is behind setting up the fires. So as a result, some of the local townsfolk are refusing to evacuate. They've formed these sort of vigilante groups. They're stopping cars at checkpoints. They've almost killed some journalists who they've mistaken for, Antifa arsonist. And it's just a really disturbing situation. And we had one of our board members, Arun Gupta, on, who lives in Portland, to talk about what's going on there. And there's a real history of the Portland police, looking the other way when these right-wing mobs come in and attack people. And then when they leave, they declare an unlawful assembly and go and arrest and attack the people they just attacked. So this is history, but this is also, if not our present, quite possibly our future.
Well, and it's in, I think you make important points there. But there's a political agenda. I mean, Peekskill is reinforcing this anti-communism, and it's saying, the American decade is, the American century is going to be what it is. And what we're seeing today is a lot more fractious. I mean, this conventional America that Trump conjures up, where white people don't have to be apologetic about their position in society, and this coalition he has with Wall Street and the evangelicals and the police and people in the military. I mean, they're being called out in the street to defend, that certain agenda. And it's in contest with, the way the country has become. How this all is going to get resolved is, on the one hand, it's, cause for an awful lot of anxiety, but it's also going to be very interesting. I think what we're going to see in the next couple of years is going to be a certain transition, for better or ill, I can't say, but I think there's a lot from history we can draw on to hopefully make things go in a better direction than where they seem to be headed at moments now.
A couple people have asked about Phil Oakes in the chats.
That's funny. I had a question about Phil Oakes the other day.
He has an FBI file. It's on the FBI.
Yeah, but Phil Oakes is, look, he's a descendant of Woody's generation. He's the folk revival of 63, 64. Let me say this about that. I think, the next project I work on might be coming back to the 60s, 70s, So maybe I'll have more to say about Phil Oakes in a couple years.
Yeah, no, his FBI file was released, and it's a very interesting story. And I know in his last days he wasn't able to sing because he had his throat slit in a mugging overseas, and he always, there was no evidence. He always thought the CIA was behind that, but there was intense FBI repression of him. One of his albums, Rehearsals for Retirement, it has the lyric, take the tap out of my phone, and his phone was actually tapped, it turned out.
Yeah, somebody pointed out too that that he also had bipolar disorder. I mean, he was somebody who dealt with a lot of issues. I mean, my view is he's great, underrated, and somebody who's going to be with us for a while, and that's a good thing. And understanding all this better is, definitely worthwhile.
Possibly the subject of the Bob Dylan song "Positively 4th Street," although that would not be a positive.
Yeah, or Irwin Silber. There's another character to.
Oh, you have a fourth book coming out, is what I hear you saying.
Well, let's see what happens, but but I think it'll be a different story than this one because it's not just so neat and tidy. So
I want to end with a quote from Donald Trump.
Oh, thank you for that.
You're welcome. From his executive order to protect monuments and statues. I'm sure you've heard that the nation's monuments are under siege from a cultural revolution. This is the language. This is an official executive order issued by the President of the United States on the White House website. Many of the rioters, arsonists, and left-wing extremists who have carried out and supported these acts have explicitly identified themselves with ideologies such as Marxism that call for the destruction of the United States system of government. Anarchists and left-wing extremists have sought to advance a fringe ideology that paints the United States of America as fundamentally unjust and have sought to impose that ideology on Americans through violence and mob intimidation. You could have put that quote at the beginning of one of your chapters and attributed it to, whatever one of the HUAC persecutors were, and we would not have realized it was not from that time period. I guess my final question is, what's the lesson for activists today from this?
I think there's an awful lot to be garnered from how people are looking at repression as this concentrated moment when it all comes down. And I make a point in the book is look at, one of the norms in U.S. society is upending norms. I mean, there's this whole notion that we have, the Bill of Rights and we have all these freedoms. But if you look at what happened to the characters in my book and what happened to the Communist Party, none of that stuff applied. And then, when time moves on, things get reversed. When there isn't quite the existential threat or the perceived existential threat, things like the Smith Act, they stay on the books, but they're not enforced anymore. So I think the lesson is there's a lot to be learned from history. The country isn't this bastion of freedom that proclaims to be, and to the degree you understand that, hopefully you'll be able to act in a way that advances the cause of a more free society. What you envision that being is, I imagine, a whole matter of debate and such. But
the book,
I'm a historian. I think there's a lot of value.
The book is The Folk Singers and the Bureau. It's available right now on Repeater Books. I believe you said for 50% off, possibly.
That's correct. Yep. And
is Threat of the First Magnitude also 50% off?
I think that's going to cost you $14, $15.
Cost you. Well, okay. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. If you want, and you have a website, right?
AaronLeonard.net.
If you want to learn more about Aaron, his work has been in Truthout, Jacobin. He's written 3 books, which I have all 3 of sitting here. Visit that website. If you want to learn more about Defending Rights and Dissent, visit rightsanddissent.org and look at all of the work we're doing. We're both pushing back against political repression. We're defending the rights of whistleblowers. We're doing all kinds of things. And if you want to listen to the Still Spying podcast, which presented this event tonight, visit stillspying.org. Thank you for tuning in, and it was a pleasure spending my evening with you.
Okay.